it shows us just how important it is for us as a church to think missionally, that we need to actually cross cultures as we mission to young people today. We can't just assume the young Australians think like us and that when they come into the church they're going to find that comfortable. And so we do need to actually exegete the culture, like Ian Hussey was saying last week, if we're going to reach these kids. And I think we have to sit with them and listen to them.
Welcome everyone to the Shock Absorber podcast. It's fantastic to have you guys along with us, whether you're listening or watching. We're here in the Third Space studio at Soraval Kirrawee, and I am joined by two regular co-hosts. Stu Crawshaw, how are you?
Hello, Joel. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And Tim, you're back. How are you?
I'm back. I'm doing well, mate.
Feeling good?
Feeling good.
Excellent. That's good to hear. We are once again talking about ministering in the 2010s and the 2020s. And we recently had Ian Hussey on the podcast talking about Australian culture. But we also then started looking at Australian culture through the lens of Australian artists. Last episode we did Tame Impala, and this episode, would you guys like to introduce who we are doing? Go on, Tim. Who we?
Sure. Yeah, we're looking at the Chats.
Yes, that's right.
Who are a Queensland punk
Shed Rock, I
Shed
believe
Rock they call themselves. Yeah. Which is great. It's fun. But yeah, so punk rock, shred rock band from Queensland.
Yeah, they're from Noosa, I think.
Noosa.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they spend a lot of time on the beach, apparently.
Yeah, well, I would too if I was living in Noosa.
Me too. That's a good point.
So we're talking about the Chats because they've got, they shine a light, I suppose, on a lot of different aspects of Australian culture, and particularly sort of young Australian culture, and also I think the punk rock nature of them and the history of punk rock gives us a bit of an insight into some of the themes we've been looking at in Ian Hussey. We
should also talk about chat, which means like it comes from the saying "that's chat" apparently, which means it's really like something terrible, disgusting. Do you guys know when that entered the lexicon of Australian culture? I can't think of it when it actually happened.
I was wondering if it was a Queensland phrase even. Like, I don't know, have you heard it around?
Yeah, it used to be like when I was in high school.
Oh, was it? Yeah,
that's
right.
chat.
Yeah,
but I don't, for you, Tim, was it?
No, I don't remember it being slang around my circles. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. As we do a cultural artefact, we actually forgot to do it in the Tame Impala episode, but the cultural artefact that we've chosen to do for this particular artist is a song called Pub Feed, which we may have talked about in a previous episode, I think, Stu. But
we did use the Chats in a previous episode for the cultural artefact.
But Pub Feed's quite a funny song because they're all just talking about how they're fanging to have a chicken snit or a steak at the pub. And I think it's funny that we're actually laughing at this particular artist because that's like they're almost like a semi kind of joke, but they're actually artists in their own right.
Well, they have a lot of fun with the Australian vernacular, don't they? So that's the jokey part of it, isn't it? But then they've got some really serious messages underneath it. Hey?
Yeah, exactly. Well, they have quite a few of them have mullets. There's only three in the band, but quite a few of them have mullets. But.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. And the mullets aren't, in my view, this is just my personal view, I don't think the mullets are 1980s mullets. They're more like the late 1970s mullets. So I kind of think they're the coolest. If you're going to have a mullet, that's the coolest. If you don't know what a mullet is, it's all business up front, party out the back. So it's like having long hair and then a fringe, if you like. So there's been some tragic examples of that through popular culture history. But I think in the 70s there was a particular style of mullet that was a bit more hardcore, edgy, comes from around the AC/DC era. And that sort of mullet is what these guys have brought back into fashion. Yeah.
It was very rock and roll kind of
feel,
wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, there was a group in the 70s called the Sharpies, and they popularised that particular mullet, and they were almost like a criminal underground in Melbourne and Sydney. I don't know if it got up to Queensland, but the Sharpies were following bands like AC/DC, while the mainstream were following other bands like Sherbet. So there was kind of like this edgy underground. They tended to be pretty full on too. They used to fight a lot and drink a lot, and so you've got a bit of that sensibility coming through with the Chats. Yeah,
I definitely agree with that. And with Pub Feed, it's talking about that they're keen to just get to the pub and have a drink and have a punt. They're just quite into.
So for people outside of Australia, maybe we need to define some of these terms.
To have to go on the pokies usually, or to have a punt on the horse racing. but or
that's gambling. Punting is
gambling. I should say that. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's right.
And the interesting thing is also that it reminded me of how there's a thing that because pokies are such a big thing, especially in New South Wales and Australia, poker machines. It reminds me of that saying, "Have a slap on the pokies" too, because you just slap the button on the pokies.
Yeah.
What about your favourite meal at a pub? Because that's what they're talking about. Yeah.
Well, they talk about the chicken schnitzel, which we call schnitters in Australia, and I reckon that's my fave.
Schnitty. Yeah. And I think I saw an interview with them. They were talking about a Parmigiana was their favourite.
Yeah, Parmigiana's good.
Yep.
That's a schnitty with
cheese
and
like a
tomatoey sauce. Yeah.
Yep.
I feel like one now, actually, as we're talking about.
Goodness me, it's early morning for a chicken
Just start the day with a parmy.
Some people do, actually.
Parmy and a VB.
Yeah, that's intense. Pub feed.
Look, anything at the pub. Yeah, this is where I have a lot of resonance with the chats over the pub feed. I think good palmy, good steak, the seafood. Yeah, some salt and pepper squid goes down well.
Salt and pepper squid.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a slightly.
Well, it depends where you go.
It's a newer addition to the regular traditional lineup, but it's still good. Yeah,
I don't know if the chats would approve.
Maybe not.
For people overseas too, a pub is a hotel. So Australians call the hotel a pub.
It's like a public house. Is that what it is?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. And this is one of the really interesting things is they've just recently, Joel, you've got the history, but they're starting to expand beyond Noosa, and so many of their songs just have fully adopted the Australian language, the slang, the vernacular, the culture. It'll be really interesting to watch. Do they continue to grow, and do they resonate with American audiences particularly, without having to change much of their language? We've had things like In the Castle as a movie is a great example of a film that embraced Australian culture so much, and it kind of translated, but not really, into the American context. We've got, Kath and Kim was a TV show, which again was just so deeply Australian in everything it did. And they tried to remake it in America with different actresses and keep the same thing. It just didn't work because there was so much about it that is Australian and resonates with our culture that doesn't necessarily translate.
I was reminded you had, in a previous episode, you talked about how with Ian Hussey actually, that and you were talking to an American pastor, and he was saying, I forgot how different Australian culture was to American. You're more like the British culture. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I was thinking as you were both talking about that, as Tim, as you were saying about Australian culture not always making sense in other cultures. Like I think we do import a lot of our culture, but we don't export a whole heap. However, within music, that's one of the big things we have exported. So we exported AC/DC. They were massive. There was a lot of bands in the 80s that made it pretty big. INXS is another good example. But also beyond the music industry, you've also got, I was just thinking as you were talking about Australian comedians that were able to make a success in America. And the only one I can really think of is Paul Hogan with Crocodile Dundee in the 80s. That was a massive hit. And I think if Australians present themselves as, there's heaps of kangaroos hopping around and we're bush people out in the bush with
shrimp
knives
on the barbie.
Yeah, well, that's a good example because like even Paul Hogan that was able to translate into the American audience when he did that ad for Australia, the Australian Tourism
was it?
Commission, he said, come over to Australia and have, instead of having a prawn on the barbecue, he said have a shrimp on the barbecue because Americans call prawns shrimps. We call them prawns. So yeah, he's tossing some prawns on the barbecue, and all the Australians that watched that ad, I remember back in the 80s, were like offended at Paul Hogan. He lost credibility with us because he changed it. But I think in America and England, there's a bit more cross-Atlantic adaptation to culture that happens there. But I think since the 70s and the 80s, Australia has entered into a bit of a dynamic where there's a little bit of cultural interchange with America and England, but not very much. But yeah, bands will keep going over to America because it's a bigger audience and they're going to get a lot more money if they get successful and they can cut it over there. As we said, AC/DC become a world phenomenon and massive in Europe and particularly in America. But then the Angels, who were the same time, they didn't actually cut it in America. So it's really hit and miss, I think, when you see bands go overseas to see if they can make it. It goes right back to when the Easy Beats went over to London in the 60s. They were probably one of the first iconic Australian rock bands, and they didn't really make much impact. But later, as I said, AC/DC, whose songs were written by some of the members, the younger brothers of
George Young.
Yeah,
right.
George Young. They actually have a really strong connection with the Easy Beat. So they kind of had 2 hits at it. And when they...
And George Young and Harry Vander, they had a lot to do with getting AC/DC out into the public
so
sphere.
Maybe they learnt from their first exploration. But what's interesting is the Chats are part of a long tradition of Australians connecting with Australian audiences, and then, okay, like you said, will it connect overseas? Fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and they're a fascinating band because, as I said, they're a 3-piece from Noosa who play shed rock, as they like to call it. Their first EP was actually recorded at their high school. So they've only have 3 pieces of recording that they've put out. So they've got 2016 EP, which is just called The Chats, which was recorded at their high school. 2017 EP was called Get This In Ya, which is really where they entered the public knowledge through the song Smoko. So that was apparently a song that they just wrote, perhaps in about a day, I believe they said. But then they also said that when they filmed the music video, it was just like they just knew someone and they just filmed it on the beach and they filmed it in his bedroom. If you actually end up watching it, it's typically budget and fits their image. So there's a line in the song where it says, "So it's Tuesday morning, my center link hasn't come through, so I pick up the phone because I've got some abusing to do. But all I get is elevator music waiting on the line on hold all the time." And while he's doing that, he opens up his computer to look at his center link, and it just has a piece of paper there saying "Seno, $0." So they've just written it on there. So
again, there's all these acronyms, like Centrelink, Seno.
Yep.
All the different words they're using are shortened words, which in Australia we love to do that. And so I think that connects with the Australian audience really quickly, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of quotes here from so the A&R, when they signed for Universal Music, and that's seen the release of their first proper album, which is in 2020, called High Risk Behaviour. The A&R rep for Universal Music who signed them said they are perfect. They have 3-minute nuggets about everyday things that are so obvious they can only be genius, which I thought was pretty cool. And High Risk Behaviour is named after the drummer who used to get done by the police for skateboarding in public. They just wrote on the ticket High Risk Behaviour. And NME called it the perfect soundtrack to being bored, broke and optimistic, which is rather interesting because they do talk about a lot of things to do with Australian culture, as we said. Pub feed is one of the things. We can go back to Smoko, which is like a very used a lot on job sites when you're having a break and it's like it's time for Smoko.
To have a cigarette.
Which is to have a cigarette as a break, is your morning break. It's called Smoko. So they still call it, I work at, my other job is at a building company and they still call it Smoko, but I think there's only like one person in the company who smokes. So it's rather interesting they still call it Smoko. Anything else that you guys think is kind of interesting about them? We can kind of get into more of the themes that they talk about.
So I think it's really cool, as you referenced with Smoko, that they're picking up elements of Australian culture that go back a long way, but it's probably picking up the fact that there still are some elements of Australian culture that, despite the fact that we've modernised so much since the 80s and we've become more of a multicultural society, and there's a whole heap of changes that are taking place in our education systems, on TV and radio, there's still a sensibility, an Australian sensibility that they seem to have hooked into that young people still really love. So I find that really interesting, that there's not this sense that, that old Australia is completely gone. So Smoko, there's one of the songs, I can't remember which one it was, where he's sitting on a esky while he's fixing up there's all these references to pop cultural icons that are very Australian. And I think that's a really fascinating element to their music, which I find myself laughing at. I mean, this is probably, when we said we're going to do the chats, this is my favourite episode, I think, from this season, because I was like, I just find myself smiling. I mean, they're profane, they're anti-religious, they're anti-institutional, they're all those things, but they've got this whimsical nature to their music that I find quite appealing, which is, again, like we've said before, that there's elements of culture that you can embrace and elements of culture you can critique. I've always found the affable Australian iconic sort of images quite appealing. So going to a pub, sitting down, eating, chips and a schnitter and having a beer, it's just so simple, but it's just really appealing. Yeah, it's like really cold beer on a summer's day. They just seem to be able to bring all of those iconic Australian moments out in their music. Yeah.
Do you think they're trying to bring those elements that you're talking about of Australian culture into the present? Because we even talked about David Bowie saying, "Oh, it's time for me to hand on to the new artist." Do you think is it almost like a thing we need to maintain these parts of Australian culture to maintain our identity, and then we can, but we're also modern? So like they're bringing back mullets, for example, and mullets have become super fashionable in younger teenage men.
Yeah, they have.
Because I think a lot of the footy players do it, but then a lot of the guys again at my work are all like, a lot of them have mullets. There's also that apathy, of course, nothing really matters. I thought that was really interesting, and everything's a joke. So it's also, maybe you were talking about those positive aspects of Australian culture that we really identify with, but you've also talked about, Stu, of there's a shadow of a lot of things, and I find that sometimes with everything's a joke or we don't care, it's almost like a way of not having to deal with the hard things in life. And I feel like they capture that a little bit too. It's like if I just act like I don't care, I don't have to deal with going through those things. What do you guys reckon?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting about that is there are a number of sociologists are starting to identify that amongst young people, there's this sense that there's so much change in society because of technology with social media and the internet, and so many new ideas that are coming into our world these days, like we've been exploring through this season, that there is a harking back amongst young people as well now, that there's a growing sense of traditionalism where young people are looking back to the past to rediscover something simpler, I think. And so for me, I think this punk sensibility that the Chats have, they call it shed music. Once upon a time it would have been called garage music. So they've kind of redefined it for their context, which I think is really cool. But they've also got this tip of the hat to garage music, and just really simple 3-minute songs is what the Ramones were doing back in the 70s. It's what the Sex Pistols were doing in London. It's what Iggy Pop and the Stooges were really pioneering in the early 70s. So a little later on we can go back and have a look at some of that. But the Clash, these kind of bands were, they were simple, but then they were also giving voice to people who didn't have a voice. And I think what's interesting about the Chats is I wonder if they're giving a voice to a certain population within the Australian community that is really resonating with it. They don't hear their voices anymore on TV. I mean, Paul Hogan once upon a time was he was a iconic Australian comedian. He came from painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge to international fame, and so there was a whole heap of working class Australians that really resonated with that and probably heard their voice. Are the Chats doing a similar thing? Maybe not on quite the same level, but there's a sense where some things in Australian culture have remained despite the changes. So the pub has changed dramatically, which we'll get to, and I think the Chats explore it when they talk about gambling, how the poker machines or the pokies have replaced live music in clubs as the main stay of pub
source of income.
So there's a whole, but gambling itself is so Australian that people really resonate with it as well. So there's a real interesting juxtaposition of current political problems in their music, but also this harking back to a simpler time. And I think some people just love singing along, smoko. They might not even smoke, but they somehow resonate with that. It's still part of their culture.
It's like harking back to, like you said, a simpler time.
Yeah.
What does punk, like you guys are both fans of punk music in different forms. What does that represent to you?
I think at one level, I'd love to hear what Tim thinks, because Tim, you're mainly into 90s punk, but I got into punk. I grew up in the 80s, and punk had already kind of died by the time I was a teenager, but I discovered it with a lot of my friends, and we got into the Clash first, and then the Ramones and Sex Pistols, and there was a band that we really loved called Radio Birdman that was from the late 70s, and they're an iconic Australian surf punk band and still remain my favourite Australian band to this day. But it wasn't just Radio Birdman, there were the Saints as well. The Saints actually tried to make it in England, didn't quite cut it. It was something about the fact that Aussies from Queensland going over from a really warm climate who were surfers going into the dark underworld of punk music in London, they didn't really connect. But punk music in America and England were feeding off each other. It kind of died off in America with CBGB's which was a venue in New York, sort of hitting its straps, but then sort of starting to fade away. Did release bands like Talking Heads and a number of other acts like Blondie and others. But when the Sex Pistols came along in London, it was almost like the Americans rediscovered punk music. And so there was this, like I talked about earlier, there's a transatlantic cultural interchange between America and England that was really obvious in those early days of punk music. And it became commercially successful for quite a while. And the Australian punk scene did have this more laconic, laid-back attitude towards it. But interestingly, in some punk circles, there's this real focus on fun and energy rather than just anger at the institution. But what you get in punk music in Australia is a combination of both. So with Radio Birdman, it was more fun punk. The Saints had more fun and angry at the same time. I mean, the Saints had a song called Know Your Product, which was a real angry protest song against commercialism and materialism. So there's what punk does is it holds a mirror up to society. It's a rusty, faded old mirror, and it doesn't set itself up as some kind of better alternative to society, but it's a music genre that just exposes the dark underbelly of society, if you like. So the Sex Pistols in the early 80s went on a barge down the Thames in London on the Queen's 25th Jubilee, singing God Save the Queen and her fascist regime on the loudspeakers, and they were saying the Queen has no future. So they were saying, what is monarchy anyway? Like, it's just rubbish. So the Sex Pistols are a good example of nihilism, and the English punk rock scene was very nihilistic. There was lots of bands that were exposing negative things, but then when The Clash came along, they also provided an alternative that other bands hadn't, because they got together with the Rastafarians in London and brought reggae music together with punk music, and that became a huge cultural moment, because then all of a sudden reggae music hit the mainstream across the world, and you get reggae coming into a whole heap of different things. But that really brought young white and black English teenagers and young adults together like nothing else ever had. So they did build an alternative in that moment. In Australia, it was more, the pub scene was massive in the late 70s and early 80s, and punk music was an edge of that pub scene. And so I think, again, with the Chats, I think they're vibing more the Australian punk sensibility rather than the English or American. The Ramones, who were the Americans, they were also a bit more fun and just chaotic. But then you also get people like Patti Smith from CBGBs, who was like a modern poet, who was also critiquing, critiquing modern capitalism. But with the Australian punk scene, just that fun. Let's have fun. Who cares what anyone thinks of us? Let's just laugh at all authority. So as Hussey would say, it's very anti-establishment. But that's how I think the Chats fit for me in that earlier scene to punk. Tim, what do you think about the 90s punk scene that you were part of?
Yeah, so as I got into 90s punk, so the bands that I was getting into in my teenage years were, The Offspring, Green Day, Blink-182, MXPX, and those kind of bands. And I think what I was noticing about, my brother's 3 years older, so he was into a lot more of the sort of the Gen X bands, the Pearl Jams and
grunge
music. And I think as I looked at that music, it was really angsty and emotive in a way that just didn't resonate with me. And so I think, I'm kind of in that cusp. I'm not quite Gen X, I'm not quite Gen Y, I'm somewhere in the middle. And so I listened to, Stone Temple Pilots and Pearl Jam, and it doesn't resonate. The themes and the feeling, the vibe of it all. Whereas I think, the 90s punk, the skate punk that I was into very much had that fun kind of aspect. And that's what I really liked. I liked that it was fun, it was jovial, it didn't take things seriously. There was an anti-establishment edge as well, which we can talk about. But as you engage with all of those different aspects, there was a fun about it. I think that's really true. That it was really great to get together. You mosh and go crazy, and the music's sort of uplifting, but it still has that critical edge. And so there are aspects of all those music which has the protest element still.
Like Green Day?
Well, yeah, so Green Day's American Idiot is a really great example. So it's a whole album which was very critical of the Bush era and the things that were going in there. You've got aspects of the Offspring's albums where they're critiquing different aspects of society. The album Americana is critiquing the sort of just suburban American.
The Pretty Fly for a White Guy.
Pretty Fly for a White Guy is a great example. The Kids Aren't All Right. Songs like that where they're just saying you've got this suburban gloss on America and that's not actually the way it is. Actually, we're corroding from the inside. And so there's a passionate plea from the youth to say that we're not actually coping here. And Blink-182 have a few songs like that as well. A lot of the early Blink-182 was very much like the Chats. It was silly and it played up, being hedonistic, lots of drinking and drugs and sex. And then when they started to get serious, that was what they were critiquing, was this, you older generation, you're not seeing that we're actually dying on the inside here. As adolescents, we're not coping. We're not coping with the high rates of divorce. We're not coping with the consumerism that you think you're blessing us with, but we're actually dying on the inside. And so there was a lot of that was being pushed out again. So that was, there is that social edge to that punk scene as well. But yeah, the frivolity that it came with, I think, rather than the angstiness of the Gen X bands, there was the doing it in that frivolous way and laughing themselves along the way was, I guess, what resonated with me more than some of those older bands.
Yeah, I had a really sad experience around that time. Green Day had a song called Hope You Had the Time of Your Life. And it's a really sad lament, really, to the sort of themes that you're talking about, Tim. There was a really tragic occurrence that took place in the Sutherland Shire where we live, where a young 16-year-old had been out partying with his mates and living the Green Day dream, really, and unfortunately lost his life when he was hit by a car, and it was incredibly tragic. And the funeral was massive. There's heaps of people went to the funeral, and I went along to the funeral, and it was quite poignant because this young person didn't have a faith, and his friends had put up a Green Day poster with a big marijuana leaf on it in front of the church that had hosted it. It wasn't at our church, but it was at another church, and this poster was put up, and they basically played "I Hope You Had the Time of Your Life" by Green Day, and I was thinking, far out, that's so dreadfully sad that there was no hope in that moment, that the music had offered fun, and it was almost like a celebration of eternal youth. But what happens when eternal youth fades? And that was obviously a dramatic moment where it had faded quite instantly. In the congregation, there was a great deal of soul searching amongst a lot of people, and after the service, a lot of young people who weren't Christians just talked to me about Jesus and were starting to search. So I think what's interesting for me about punk music is I don't think it's an end in itself. I think sometimes people who get into punk music then ask the question, so what's the next thing? What is there to offer? Because it is so nihilistic that punk music doesn't really pretend to offer anything other than a critique, really, at its most basic, I think. I mean, there might be others who might want to jump online and talk about that, but it's just about the moment, and what happens after that moment is something where I think we can speak into as Christians. We can talk about that a bit more later, but yeah, that's something I find interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that also, so after the 90s punk came the emo music, which really resonated with a lot of the romanticism a few centuries ago. And it was interesting because...
Like a new gothic scene, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was this gothic sensibility where punk music is rebelling against the structures, and it is anti-institutional in a way that, let's kick over tables and let's cause a scene and let's be angry at the world. So there's those kinds of themes. Whereas the emo, the gothic and the romanticism from centuries ago turns that inwards and says, well, if the world is letting me down, has no hope, then all I can do is turn inward and look at myself. And so that was another thing that didn't resonate with me, as bands like My Chemical Romance and others where it was all about turning inwards and thinking, well, I'll just sit here with my sadness, didn't resonate, because again, the nihilism becomes complete at that point, and the only thing I've got is myself. Whereas the punk sensibility still has that I'm raging against the system, and there might be some change that comes out of that. I'm actually rebelling so that we can institute change. And I think there's still, yes, a nihilism, but maybe a glimmer of hope that says, maybe if we cause enough ruckus that we can create a change and the change that is needed. Whereas emo seems to have almost given up on the hope of change. And so all I've got is myself.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a Christian punk band as you're talking about that, MXPX, and they've got a great song, Teenage Politics, Too Confusing. They sing that, and I remember watching a whole room full of people moshing to Teenage Politics. It's almost like this moment where everyone's like together in punk music. It's not necessarily individualistic, I'm alone by myself. I remember another young teenager in the 90s who said to me once, she said, when I listen to punk music, I feel really alone, but I feel alone with everyone else. And I think what you're saying with emo that came later was very isolating. Yep. But there's this fun where we can say teenage politics is very confusing, but at least we're all here together and let's have fun. Yep. So
it's interesting that a number of albums later, MXPX released their single was Responsibility, and the line responsibility not yet. And here are these late 20s, maybe early 30s by that stage, singing about, let's not have responsibility. Again, it goes back to that, let's just be frivolous and not take things too seriously.
Yeah. I still see people my age with T-shirts every now and again that say skateboarding is not a crime written on them, and I think that's still, some people still carrying that on for a long time, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if you can bring it back to the chats and around those concepts that you're talking about. The bass player and the frontman, Eamon Sandwith is his name. He said, "We don't make songs for people to look at in an emotional or intellectual way. We just make songs for people to jump around and have fun to." But I think that's part of that frivolous thing you're talking about. But then there's also that the way they are doing it seems to have elements of nihilism and elements of there's no hope, that the youth are crying out for certain things. The chats didn't really get political, except that the frontman wrote a song about the bushfires at some point. But I'm just wondering if we are looking at these artists talking about certain parts of the culture, what is the church's response to these kind of things? So if the chats are talking about drinking and gambling and not really caring about stuff. Apathy is something that Ethan brought up on the podcast last week. Loneliness is another thing loneliness is a thing that we talked about in the last episode around Tame Impala that Kevin Parker, the writer of all that music, brings up. What do you guys think is the church's response to those kind of things? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think the good thing about the chats is, again, you see some anti-religious themes. You see some anti-government themes, criticising Scott Morrison for his response to the bushfires. The song where they're describing getting kicked out of a pub.
Drunk and Disorderly.
Drunk and Disorderly, yep. And
keep the grubs out.
Yeah, no, keep the grubs out is what I'm thinking about. And they describe themselves as grubs. So they're saying the manager of this pub says to them instantly when they walk into the pub, "You've got bad haircuts. You guys are grubs. You're trouble. You're out of here. I'm not even going to give you a chance.
Come back when you get a haircut."
Come back when you get a haircut. And I think the jarring nature of the chats for us as Christians is a lot of young people probably think we're like the manager in that song, that we're probably going to look at them and go, "Get out of our church, you're grubs." And so they assume that we're going to think they're grubs. And so that's jarring. And actually, when you talk to a lot of young people, they will kind of be a bit awkward and think, am I just about to get in trouble? Because a lot of people see the church as people who are going to get them into trouble. The church doesn't agree with their drinking, their gambling, their attitudes towards sex, their attitudes towards life, really. And so I think we can actually delve into some of those issues a bit more deeply to ask ourselves the question, what is the church's response to each of those different issues? But I think the first thing to take into account is that when we're dealing with young people, young Australians, not all young Australians listen to the chats, but there is a lot of young people that get into this music because it's a very popular subculture within our country still. And amongst a lot of young Australians, particularly a lot of Anglo-Australians listen to this kind of music. And I think sometimes, to me, they can sometimes be the hardest to talk to about Jesus, because it's almost like our culture in general has already rejected the church for many decades, and this is the latest iteration of describing that rejection. And so that it's almost a done deal now. It's like, well, you're here, you're institutional, we're young people, we're anti-institutional, we have nothing in common. And when you look at it, the culture of the church and the culture of the songs that the chats sing about is so vastly different. If you listen to the music in the church, the things we sing about is honouring God and talking about love and care, stuff like that. They're talking about having a smoko, being treated like grubs. They're talking about getting sexual transmitted diseases. They're talking about being arrested by the police. They're talking about drink driving. They're talking about all these different things. And I think it shows us just how important it is for us as the church to think missionally, that we need to actually cross cultures as we mission to young people today. We can't just assume the young Australians think like us and that when they come into the church they're going to find that comfortable. And so we do need to actually exegete the culture, like Ian Hussey was saying last week, if we're going to reach these kids. And I think we have to sit with them and listen to them. And this is the part of the shock absorber that we've been repeating many times, but it's really relevant today, that if we're going to understand kids, we need to be places, not just to talk to them, but to be at places where they're at to just to listen to what they talk about. And, where do young people hang out? If you're down at the beach and you see a group of young people, some Christian adults will go across the other side of the path to not have to walk through the young people. Maybe sit on a park bench next to them and just listen to the kind of stuff they're talking about. And maybe try to talk to them, say, oh, hi, how you going? And what are you guys up to? And ask them what they do. And obviously in appropriate ways in public. But that sort of is really important for us as Christians. I think our culture is so far removed from this world. It's absolutely so stark. It's night and day. So I think we can talk about reaching Christian teenagers who predominantly still have a Christian culture. But when you look outside of this very small group of Christian teenagers, it's a very different world. And we have to ask ourselves some really big questions. How does the church talk to these kids? How do we listen to these kids? But the shock absorber says young people are the cultural shock absorbers, and we need to listen to our teenagers too. How do you talk to your non-Christian friends? What sort of things do they talk about? I'm always fascinated to talk to my son Elijah about what sort of things he and his friends talk about. So even if you find it too threatening to talk to young people outside of the church, you can talk to some of our young people about what are teenagers like today? What sort of things do they care about? Or if that's even too threatening, listen to the chats. Go on iTunes, listen to their songs. It's quite confronting because you'll actually be, if you take notes at some of the things that they're talking about, how widely different they see the world to the gospel is quite striking. So I might be going on a bit there, but I'm actually thinking it's a really important point to think the chats actually, I think, show us that young people in Australia are drifting further and further away from the church all the time, every generation. I mean, back in 2008, I think it was, the Catholic Church did a survey called the Spirit of Gen Y, and in that survey they found that at the time Gen Ys were less spiritual than Gen X's or the baby boomers, and they predicted that would continue, that trend, that young people would become less and less spiritual. And I think the chats are a good example of the fact that that trajectory is continuing, and we need to understand that, because not only are young people anti-institutional or anti-organised religion like they used to be in my generation, there was still a sensibility towards spirituality with my generation. People would talk about New Age religions or other religions. But the Spirit of Gen Y found in the 2008 that young people were not only less interested in organised religion, they're actually less interested in spirituality altogether. So our young people are becoming more and more secular and less spiritual. And I think that's what the chats highlight.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, they have a song called "Do What I Want," which highlights that very fact of it's more individualist, as we talked about with Ian Hussey as well, but also these particular issues that are important, but ones that we perhaps don't identify with as much. The chats are trying to talk about, we just want to have fun, but then still trying to recall things of the Australian culture and then bring it all back to say, well, we're all just having a laugh anyway, which is an interesting way of looking at Australian culture. I feel like it's a new version of that 70s, 80s, 90s culture in Australia. What it makes me think of is if you've ever seen the Instagram account called Brown Cardigan, where it's just videos that people find of people doing silly things. There's also the Inspired Unemployed, with a couple of guys that do skits about Australian culture. The other thing that I thought was interesting, though, is they bring up gambling quite a lot, and I believe that has gradually increased. I was doing a little bit of research in Australian gambling, and apparently the first time gambling happened was on a horse race in 1810 in Australia. So it's been around for a while. But I did see in...
that was probably organised gambling too. I reckon it would have been happening underground a lot longer than that.
That's probably very, very true. I was just looking at some stats from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, it's a policy department of the Australian government. And in 2018, 2019, Australians lost approximately $25 billion on only legal forms of gambling. So it's probably a fair bit more if there's illegal forms of gambling. But as you alluded to earlier, Stu, approximately in New South Wales, there's approximately 95,800 poker machines, which, as you also said, killed the music scene in the pubs. But that is a state and a statistic only beaten by Nevada, where Las Vegas is, which is really just a casino town. And between 2017 and 2018, New South Wales clubs made a net profit of $1.9 trillion, and hotels also made a net profit of $1.1 trillion from pokies, just pokies alone. And since 1982 up to 1997, it's the proportion of household disposable income spent on gambling has doubled almost doubled from 1.7% to 3.2%, and that comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So what I've also observed with also some particularly younger men is how easy it is to bet now, because you can do it on your phone. So you've got gambling apps, and
it's a huge problem.
Yeah, and so you've got gambling apps, and you can just go, well, I've got some money in my account, I'll just put a bet on this particular sport or this particular game, or if it's horse racing. But I also think the darker side of that, as we talk about before with particular issues, is that it's easy to hide if you've got a gambling issue there too. It's just on your phone. Not many people touch your phone except for yourself. So if you're going to perhaps delve into gambling quite a bit, it's quite easy to do so. Tim, have you got any thoughts on that? Like, not just gambling, but we've talked about how does the church respond to that. The chats are bringing up things like gambling, or we just go have a slap on the pokies. What would you say the way that the church should try and understand that? Stu's talked about listening to younger people. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think part of that, in order to listen, you have to be in proximity with them. And one of the problems that we will have as a church is if these young people are expressing anti-establishment, anti-institutionalism, and they see us as an institution, then we could ask the question, okay, what would it be like if they walked through our doors? The reality is they're not going to. They're very literal. It'd be very surprising if any of the chats in the world that they live in actually walked through a church door. And so it might be great to have welcoming cultures and great ministries where you're ready to listen as they walk in, but the expectation that they'll come into the door may be far-fetched. And so we have to be thinking as churches, if we're going to be missional, and we talked about this last season, Chap Clark's material on that, what is it actually going to be like for us to be out in the community so that we are actually engaging with these young people in a way that is in their world? Because if we're just inviting people into our space, hoping that they'll come to us, if we build it, they will come, is probably not going to be the case for a lot of these young people. And one of the things that they're striving for is hope. They're striving for truth. The whole pursuit of hedonism is about how do I get the best out of this life. And if we truly believe that Jesus and the gospel offers the best life, this is actually, Jesus said, I came to give life to the full, then we need to be able to provide that to them in a space where they're able to be. So we need to be thinking about how do we actually get into proximity with these young people. and what does that look like? And to think creatively about how do we actually do that as individuals, as a church, so that we can actually bring the gospel to them, that we can reconcile ourselves to them and them to Christ and be advocates for that.
I think the concept of hope that you talked about, Stu, is really, for me, it feels like really important. It's that we talked about the nihilism of punk music and how a lot of people may be feeling like that if the chats are bringing that out of the culture. Tim's talking about being missional, Stu. What do you think in terms of how we can be more missional in that respect?
There's a really big barrier that we don't often talk about in the church to us and the people who listen to the chats, and it is a class barrier. So the church tends to be quite middle class in Australia, and so we have middle class sensibilities, and we have middle class behaviours, and we have middle class sins. So working class sins are often a lot more public and a lot more. You were talking before, Joel, about betting on a football game on an iPhone. That's more of a middle class way of gambling and a private way of sinning, whereas working class sins can often be celebrated and very public. So to go down to a local pub with your mates, you publicly walk into a bar, you publicly go in to the pokies, and you sit there while everyone can see you gambling, and you often share your wins and losses publicly too. You see people celebrate when they occasionally win, and also drown their sorrows when they don't. People sit there watching the horse races together in public and fill out their bets and place them. They have Keno coming up in their pubs. These are predominantly working class pursuits and working class recreational activities that a lot of middle class Christians would see as sinful and would not condone, although there is a difference between Catholic perceptions on that and Protestant perceptions. I mean, Catholic clubs, you have pokies in the Catholic clubs. I went Club Menai last week for dinner with some friends, and there were all the pokies in this Catholic club, which is an anathema to many Protestants. But what we've got here with this kind of, I suppose, public display of sinfulness, smoking is considered a working class sin by a lot of Christians these days. They'd find it uncomfortable if someone lit up a cigarette outside a church. The rowdiness of the young kids in this band is also something that would be considered like a very benign, but a working class sin. It's not very polite. It's not very functional. It's not very educated. It's very raw and enthusiastic, and those kind of emotions don't always sit well in the calm sort of serenity of a sacred space where Christians gather and do important things. So having a bunch of young people coming and disrupting that moment is actually an anathema. So I think one of the things we need to think about is how do we create our spaces to be more organic before and after our gatherings, I think, so that we actually do hang out and be human and just have social time together, so that if people do come along, like you were saying, Tim, there is a space where they can be social with us and we can get to know them and they can get to know us. It's not all straight up formality, because at the moment a lot of our churches will start on time, and then there'll be all this corporate worship, which is terrific, and we have corporate worship in our setting too, but it's often stylistic and symbolic and highly focused on educated people. And so it's sort of really difficult for people like people who would go to the pokies and their worship is they're worshipping other things and other idols, but the way they're used to doing that is together. And funnily enough, when they come into our context, there's a good chance they may feel judged, even if they're not. And even if they're not consciously judged, they may be there might be looks of derision that are cast their way. I mean, I remember a bunch of kids who'd just come past our church one day at Kirrawee. Now, admittedly, our church is a factory, so it doesn't look like a church. And so the young people came along to check out what's this place with all these people here. And they came cruising down the driveway. They'd been drinking. Some of them had been smoking drugs. They were laughing and carrying on, and they were swearing. And some of them were vaping, which is a lot more common amongst young people these days than smoking. They're coming down. But our youth leaders, instead of looking, oh, hang on, what's this threat coming down? They went out straight to them and met them halfway down the driveway and said, hey, do you guys want to play basketball with us? And they're like, yeah, basketball, why not? So there was this kind of chat sensibility of, might as well play basketball at this moment right now. They got that, and they were able to connect with that. And so even though they didn't know these kids personally or what they were thinking in their world, they got a sense from the fact that they just thought, let's just hang out. So they shot hoops with these kids for about 45 minutes, and then they left. And then one or two of them every now and again come back and visit, because it wasn't a hostile reception. It was a very welcoming thing. And there was something known for them to go from the known to the unknown of church. And so if we can create spaces in our church with our architecture that aren't cultural walls to people, that they don't look at that and go, oh, I wouldn't be welcome in there. You know, we're talking about smoko and pub feeds and all these great Australian terms. Well, another great Australian saying is, I wouldn't go into a church because the roof would fall in if I went into a church. And that's a real Aussie way of saying, I'm not good enough to be there. And if I went into that building, the whole thing would collapse because I'm so evil and corrupt. I would corrupt them. And we would say with the gospel, of course, we're all sinners. We all need Jesus. But what I think a lot of young people in Australia see is we think they're sinners, and we think that we're perfect and that we judge them. So I think that sort of conversation that we're having around that is really helpful.
Yeah, the class question is a really interesting one as well, because it's been, all throughout church history, there's the question about what is gospel and what is culture. And, we sort of look back on the missions that came out of the UK a number of centuries ago, and we can see quite obviously the aspects that were more English and colonial than they were Christian. But we can often be blind to our own ways of saying the gospel I'm presenting is just the gospel, isn't it? It's pure and clean. And actually, we can actually be masking a number of middle class questions and assumptions, and, as you say, sins or holiness.
Which middle class people often do privately rather than publicly.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right.
Drink privately at home. I think there's a big problem with pornography use amongst middle class people. Yep, they wouldn't go to a strip show. They wouldn't do that, but they would still indulge in all those things privately, and then come and have a public face that looks a lot more presentable.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think it's part of what it will mean to, we talk about intergenerational ministry, but an intercultural, interclass, ministry that actually has people from all of those who are able to speak into and critique. We had a lovely friend of ours when I was children's minister at a previous church, who was much more lower socioeconomic than the rest of the church. And she was wonderful because she could really gently say to me, you've just asked families to do this, this and this, which costs this amount of money. I don't have that amount of money. And so you need to think carefully about the things that you're assuming families can afford. And it was really great because we were such good friends that she could say, we can't afford this, and there may be other families who can't afford this who might not be comfortable enough to come and tell you, but you're making middle class assumptions. You're assuming the kids can afford this, $100 camp, and then this couple of $100 here, and then this here, and that's not the reality for all the families in our suburb. And that was a really helpful critique because we had someone who was in a different socioeconomic class who was able to push back and critique, and by listening to her, that was the shock absorber. That was going, no, I want your voice to impact the way I do ministry.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it goes even deeper actually too, because we in our church at Soul Revival, we dress like people in the Southern Shire, but I remember being told by an American visiting church growth speaker once that actually Christian pastors need to dress above the rest of the community so they'll get respect. So you look at the community you minister to, and then you dress a bit better than them. You spend a bit more money on your clothes, and then they'll respect you as. And I always thought that was a bit of, maybe it's the egalitarian part of me as an Australian, the tall poppy syndrome, but it's the egalitarianism in the sense that everyone's equal. Well, that's the myth in Australia, isn't it? That we're all mates and we shouldn't. No, everyone should have a fair go. That's what I mean by that in that context. But what we've experimented with a bit here at Soul Revival is we'll wear baseball caps in church and wear T-shirts in church when we're leading services, and some people find that a little unsettling because it's like I'm not dressing up in a collared shirt and chinos and some nice dress shoes. But what I say to people when they come up to me and ask me why am I wearing a hat in church, I'll say, sometimes people have scriptural issues with that, which we could talk about another time. We don't have time to go into that right now. But what we are trying to do is go, well, people in Sutherland Shire will go out to an expensive restaurant down at Cronulla and wear a baseball cap to dinner. People will wear a T-shirt to a more formal, and so we're actually just missional. We're contextualised. We're actually just doing what other, if you go to the soccer, this is how people dress at local football clubs or when they go and see the Sharks play. And it's not about, and I think we do have to give God honour, and we have to also not dress in a way that is completely disrespectful. And obviously that's fairly a different scale for different people. But what we have found is in the Sutherland Shire, there's over 50% of people are tradespeople and work in trades. But in the churches, the statistics are that only 2% of our churches have tradespeople in the churches. At Soul Revival, because we have been a little bit more accessible, I suppose, for tradespeople, there's 17% of our community are people who work in trades. And so there is a missional element to trying to say, let's not just be a church for middle class people. Let's be a church for everyone. And so what does that look like? And that's where, like I said, it opens up a whole can of worms, doesn't it, about difficult conversations about, is it okay to wear a hat in church? Isn't it disrespectful? Or is it a shame for a man to cover his head in church? I mean, we can have all those kind of conversations. But that's what we're encouraging through this podcast, isn't it? That we have the conversation. I'm more fearful of not having the conversation than having the difficult conversation. So I think if people are not talking about how we can talk about dressing or not dressing for the gospel, that can be difficult. But it's even worse if we just assume everyone who's going to come is going to be like us. And if they are a bit different to us, then that's wrecking what we're trying to do here. Another small example of that is even the conversations we have in church can actually put people off. I remember sitting in church listening to two guys talking one day and picking up on what Tim was saying about income. The two guys were saying that they had jet skis, and another guy came into the conversation and they said to him, he was new to the church, and they said to him, oh, you should come jet skiing with us. You should get yourself a jet ski. And the guy's like, oh, and I said, I just jumped in and I said, oh, don't worry if you can't get a jet ski. You're welcome to just go and ride on there. So, because what I was worried about being communicated was I don't want people to think that you have to be able to spend $20,000 on a pastime in order to be a part of the church. Now, I don't think the two guys talking about jet skis would have for a second wanted to give the impression that you could only be accepted here if you could buy a $20,000 jet ski. But it was sort of starting to cross that person's mind, oh, do I need to get a jet ski to fit in with these guys so I can be friends with them and be part of this church? Because straight away, that's going to count out a lot of people who can't afford that.
I'm just wondering, I think it was a really good point, by the way, Stu. We're talking about being more missional, and you were talking about to have more informal, organic time around our gatherings. Is that perhaps one of the ways that we can embrace and or critique culture, that public gathering thing? You were talking about a lot of we're very middle class, but a lot of different classes, say a working class background, would be doing that a lot more in public. I remember Michael Tuckett in the episode talking about how we do everything very much in public, where a lot of Westerners hide it behind closed doors, like you've talked about as well. So is that having that formal and informal time, especially informal time for those kind of things, is that where you're going with how we can still be missional?
Yeah, well, Ian was talking in the podcast we had him on, is that some of the collectivist impulses of other cultural groups can be a corrective to our hyper-individualism. And I think that Michael Duckett is a good example of that with Aboriginal churches. There's more of a public openness towards things. There are lots of churches around that aren't middle class, and I think it would be good for people in middle class churches to visit other churches to get a sense of how other people worship God together in those contexts. But one thing I think is really important, and that is that we're actually willing to change, that we don't have to just have a cultural representation of church that we're comfortable with. And again, Ian Hussey was saying that the danger of the homogeneous unit principle is that we create comfortable context for people to be with other people like themselves, not negating the fact that it has missional outcomes that are terrific, that if you don't have to cross cultural barriers to hear the gospel, that's a good thing. But that story I told earlier about those teenagers who came down the driveway suggests to me it is possible to cross cultural boundaries in mission if we are open to embrace difference and not sameness. So we really do need to have a good hard think to ourselves. Are we willing to embrace people who are different to ourselves? And that is uncomfortable because I don't always know what questions to ask or what to say. I might accidentally make someone else uncomfortable by talking about a pastime I'm interested in. But it's worth the effort to engage in that discomfort and embrace it, and to do that for the sake of the gospel. I see in Jesus' ministry that he taught his disciples many, many times in public. And I love the beginning of Matthew 5 where it talks about Jesus sitting the disciples down and teaching them, and the crowds gathered around the edges. I think what would be really exciting in Australian churches in the 2020s is that we look at how can we interface with the crowds better as a church. It could be that, do we sometimes do a church service outside in a park? I'm about to get in the car and go to Brewarrina after I finish this podcast, and I'm going to drive about 10 hours away from Sydney to be with Isaac and Eileen and the Brewarrina church up in Brewarrina, which is in northwestern New South Wales, right up near the Queensland border. And Isaac's invited me to speak at his church tomorrow night. And his church will be meeting in the park, and we'll be doing what's called an open air church service where we will preach and sing and have fellowship. And what's really good about a public service like that, when we're allowed to do it, and we've got permission from the local authorities to do it, is that you have a semi-permeable membrane around the edge of the church where, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but a semi-permeable membrane is where when you have a membrane like that, the particles that are inside can go outside and the particles that are outside can come inside. So water, for example, can go in and out of a semi-permeable membrane. So the water outside of the membrane can go in and the water inside can go out. And I think that culturally we've created the opposite of that in many of our churches, where it's a permeable membrane. It's really difficult to actually come into that. And by going outside on the grass with our school ministry for many years, just like in Brewarrina, doing Christian ministry together outside means that when we go into a school at Kirrawee High School where we're allowed to sit out on the grass and do Bible study on the grass, I can stand on the grass and do a Bible study with the Christian kids that are there, and non-Christian kids who are just walking around, number one, can see us. They can also see that we're just normal people and we're just sitting around talking about things sometimes that they're interested in, and sometimes a waft of an idea might just go past their ears and they can come and sit on the edge of that gathering without joining it, and they can just listen. And I think that's what's being captured there in Matthew 5. Jesus is teaching his disciples one of the most beautiful sermon, probably the most beautiful sermon, like Sermon on the Mount. And as he's saying, blessed are the peacemakers. You know, there's people in the crowds that are going, wow, I wonder what he means by that. And then he'd tell parables so that the people, I mean, it's just a beautiful example of what I think we can recapture. And I think it's great we've got all our church buildings, but I think if we can not only individually get outside our church buildings to be in the community, but get outside the church buildings together, that is a really exciting prospect to me. So, yeah, that's one thing I think the Chats teaches me, that there are groups that do similar things. I think we've got to be careful though as we do it. Sometimes I hear young adults say, the people at the pub don't come to church, so we're going to go to the pub and we're going to be Christians there so that they can become Christians. And I hear people talking about evangelism in pubs, and I say be very careful, because I've often seen more people evangelised by the pub than I've seen people come out of that pub culture. But what we did in the early 90s was we identified, a lot of the teenagers go to the pub more than they come to the church, but they also go to school. And, if we're allowed to go and hang out with them and teach the Christian kids at school, and we can do that out on the grass, and other people can be welcome to come and listen or not. It's opt-in, opt-out. There's a whole heap of really helpful government regulations around that now, that if people want to join a group like that, they can get a permission note from their families. So if they walk past and hear something interesting, they can go home to their mum, hey, can I grab a permission note to go along to that group next week? But at least they know that they're welcome if they'd like to come. And I think maybe that's where I'll end that, is that are we welcoming to people like the people who listen to the Chats?
That's cool. Any final words there, Tim, before we wrap up the episode?
Well, yeah, I think that last idea about being evangelized by the world rather than evangelizing the world is just a really good one to hold on to, because we can have good intentions to go and be missional in these different proximities without actually having change being seen and us being opting into that. And it's also easy to think, oh, I'm being missional, when actually I'm just chasing the things that I really want to do that aren't
spiritualizing what you want to do. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. I had a conversation with the church a number of weeks ago now, thinking about their Sunday morning programs, and it's a church that's close to the beach, and they were saying a lot of our families engage in nippers. You know, should we do nippers, encourage our families to do nippers in the morning so that they can learn those skills and they can be Christian influence in those places, and then come do a kids ministry in the afternoon and invite those nippers to the afternoon. And we talked back and forth about a number of different pros and cons. And I said, oh, well, okay, what if you all, as all of the families in your church said, hey, because for the sake of mission, we're all going to go to this particular clubhouse on the beach and we're going to join the nippers there. And immediately one of the people in the conversation said, oh, except I don't live closest to here. I live down the road. So I'd probably go to that one and they go to this one. And all of a sudden I was like, what? Are you actually doing it to be missional, or actually you want your kid to do nippers, and this is a convenient way to get your nippers in and your church in the most convenient way for you and your family? And I think that can be the same, whether it's the pub, whether it's joining a soccer club, all of these things which can sound spiritualized and can sound missional, but I think it's a good thing for us to stop and to check our own motives and to be thinking, okay, but am I doing this just to, as you say, spiritualize my own preferences? Or is it actually putting me out? For me to go and join nippers, man, that'd be missional, because I don't do a lot of swimming in the surf. But there's other things that I could easily do. Oh yeah, I'm just going to go to punk rock shows every weekend, and I'm going to be a Christian in all of those places, and that's going to be my ministry. And I was like, well, really, or are you just enjoying the music and the pub scene? So yeah, we have to think about those. But I love that idea of the semi-permeable membrane, and I think that example of the young crew walking into the church property and playing basketball is a good example.
Part of the that's exactly what that was.
Yeah, and it's also the same. I know that our ministries here, both our kids and our youth ministries on Friday nights, will often go into the park across the road and run just their usual thing in the park, so it is in the open. And that way you've got the community listening, you've got other teenagers who just happen to be playing basketball or soccer who are seeing this other group of confident Christians.
Confident Christians is a great phrase.
Yeah, who they love Jesus, and here they are loving Jesus, and then they'll all sit down and a young adult will stand up and open the Bible in the middle of this public place and just read the Bible. And the teenagers that have been swearing and drinking and playing basketball will go, what is going on over there? And again, that just creates that semi-permeable membrane where they're able to go, that's really weird. What are you guys? Oh, we're a church, Oh, we love Jesus. We love playing soccer. So here we are playing soccer and loving Jesus at the same place. And so that confidence of not having the cultural cringe, I think we've talked about that before on the podcast, but just being confidently Christian, but also just being able to be out and about. I think that's really positive. And so that we are accessible.
Yeah, I don't know if I got the opposite. Is that?
Yeah, that's right.
So semi-permeable membrane, the opposite is permeable membrane. Is that correct?
I think so.
I'm not sure if I've got that right, but
I've got to go back to Year 9 science.
Yeah, one of our listeners or
well, I think permeable would be completely in and out. So
non-permeable?
Non-permeable, I think.
That's probably what I said the wrong thing.
Someone can correct us in the comments.
That's right, yeah. So if there's any scientists listening, we'd love your feedback. But I think the general idea is pretty clear, like just to do that. I love what you said about a confident Christian too, Tim, because I think the thing that we can embrace with the chats is their confidence and their fun and their frivolity. And their frivolity and the fact that they don't really care what people think of them. And I think maybe Christian teenagers sometimes care a little bit too much about what people think of their faith. And if we can encourage and embolden Christians to be a bit more like the chats. And I think that's why I like punk music as a Christian. I think I've somehow connected that with, I think the actions in the church, I reckon following Jesus is awesome. And I think having fun doing that together, as well as, we have a saying at Soul Revival where we have sober joy. So we have a sobriety in the knowledge that we come together to, in the name of Jesus, and that God is the God of the whole universe, and that gives a sobriety to what we do. But then there's also a joyfulness in being together as Christians as well. And so the idea of being in public and having fun together and then sitting down reading the Bible together is a good example of that sober joy. And I think that's what the chat says to me more than anything, actually. Rather than seeing them as this different kind of people that I somehow need to reach, I feel like they've taught me to to just relax with being who I am and embrace it and enjoy it. And just as they're digging back into the traditions of the pub and the smoko and those things that are quintessentially Australian, what is it to be quintessentially Christian? Can we get excited about being quintessentially Christians and that our values and our identity in Christ is actually really exciting, and we have this to enjoy, and we have so much to live for, because Jesus says, I've come to give you life and life to the full, not don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. And I think what deconstructs the church from being an institution to being what it actually is, which is a family, a big group of friends, is when people see our relationships and actually can be a part of having a bit of fun with us, as well as coming to church and being obviously having a lot of sobriety together. But there's also the joy that in there as well. But if we as the church can have our social time together sometimes in public, then that means that people can come and join with us in a way that they might not feel like they could do. People drive past churches every day and never once think, I wonder what's happening in there, and go in there to go and see. But if we're out in having a picnic and someone's reading a Bible, I've had this happen multiple times where people have gone, oh, what are you reading? Tell me about that. Going back to the pub thing too, we're not saying don't go to the pub and have a pub feed. We've all just celebrated, we all like a pub feed. But just be careful you go into the pub with your identity and you come back out of the pub with your identity. And if you don't feel strong enough to do that, go in with other people who are, or don't go to that particular place until you're stronger as a Christian. But one person I think I want to give a shout out to who's done that really well in the past is a young friend of mine called Riley Spring. And when he first started going to the pub with his friends, he used to be like a Christian version of the chats, where he'd deconstruct the whole pub thing by getting a schooner of milk, and he'd go in there and he'd have a lot of fun saying, I'll have a schooner of milk please, and then he'd sit there boldly drinking his milk as though it was a beer, and his friends thought it was hilarious and used to have a lot of fun. So that's his version of having a mullet, walking into a pub. He's deconstructed their world, and all of a sudden they became the institution, and they were the institutional reality because they were gambling, they were drinking, they were smoking. And to be different to that was saying, actually, I'm not going to fit into what you say I have to be. And Australians find that appealing, that when someone's got the courage to go, actually, you're all saying you're anti-institutional, but look at the institution you've built. As Christians, we're going to go into that institution and we're going to mess that up, just like the chats want to walk in and mess up other institutions. We're messing this up. So we're not drinking, actually. We don't need to be having social time. Oh, but you have to. Why? Who says? The institution of the pub that says you have to gamble and you have to drink? Well, actually, I like drinking milk and I'm going to drink it. And so everyone, if you do it in the right attitude with humility and fun, I think it can be a bit like the chats.
That's something we can definitely learn from them. I don't know. Have you ever seen the Democracy Manifest guy?
No.
So there's a guy called Paul Charles Dozer, and he was in the early 90s. He was recorded being arrested. And he's talking, this is Democracy Manifest. And then he's like, what's the charge? Eating a meal, a succulent Chinese meal? They took him out of a Chinese restaurant. But the chats put him in their Dine and Dash, the song Dine and Dash, in the music video. Right. So just capturing that frivolous aspect, I think, is pretty cool. But doing it in a way that really shines a light on Jesus rather than says we need to be part of this culture as well.
Yeah, we don't copy the culture. Yeah. We be Christian, but we're not afraid of them either. Yeah. And maybe we might even hang out with them sometimes.
That's all right. Well, that's a really good way to end. So thank you very much, guys, for joining us on this podcast. It's been a very interesting chat, again, as usual, about the chats. That is actually the last episode for 2021, guys. Thank you very much for jumping on board with us at any time during 2021. We will take a pause on recording new episodes, but doesn't mean we're not releasing content, because in the next few weeks we're going to bring out content from our Shock Absorber conference back in October, which will be very exciting, and hopefully you gain a lot of value from that. But for now, we will say thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching all across this year. We really appreciate it, and we'll finish up with, as usual, with a
One way.
One way.